I'm not sure how many of us have met before. My name is Bernard Tracy and I'm prior here. And it's a great pleasure to introduce and present Father Martin Browne from Glenstal Abbey. There's a great friendship between the Irish Dominicans and Glenstal Abbey, going back to the 40s and 50s, to various friars being welcomed there as teachers, and then as friends, and friars even being allowed to be involved in some of the congresses that have been organised by the monks. Glenstal Abbey has been a leader in helping the Irish Church to understand what it is to be a worshipping church. The Glenstal liturgical conferences of the 1960s and 70s were formative for a whole generation. And now there are new generations in the Abbey, and it's a pleasure to introduce Father Martin Browne. Martin is a native of County Clare, worked in media for a fair number of years before entering the monastery, graduate theology in Durham, and he's now a man of many parts, principally headmaster in the Abbey School. But Benedictines are people of learning and insight, and it's a pleasure to have Martin among us, and I'm looking forward eagerly to what he's now going to say to us about Pope Francis and the Latin Mass.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you. It's very daunting to have a Dominican say that the Benedictines are people of learning, because I don't think there's anybody more learned in the church than the Dominicans. And in fact, as Bernard was just saying, when Glenstal was founded first, and the first generation of Irish monks were studying, many of them didn't go out to university to study theology. Instead, a number of Dominicans came to live in the monastery and taught them in the house. So he wasn't exaggerating when he was saying that the links between Glenstal and the Irish Dominican province go back a long way. So it is very nice to be among you. So what has Pope Francis said about the Latin Mass? Well, if he were the kind of church nerd like me, who regularly browses what is often called the Catholic blogosphere, or its close cousin, the Catholic Twitter sphere, you might be inclined to think that this topic is one of the biggest issues in the life of the Church at this moment in history. If your web browsing was confined to the more conservative or traditionalist Catholic online world, you would certainly think that it was absolutely the most important issue in the Church today. More important than the Synod and the Pope's efforts to promote synodality, more important than evangelization, more important than the climate and migrant crises. That would be the impression you could get online. The online world, especially the polemical echo chambers of social media networks, can give a false impression of the level of attention that particular issues attract from people at large, not just with regard to church affairs, but regarding all forms of public discussion and debate. Of course, those who manage blogs and podcasts and social media accounts often do so with the express intention of drawing more people's attention to their causes and concerns, and they're often very successful at doing so. The impact of social media on public opinion and decision-making is a huge and under-discussed issue, but it's probably one for another conversation, so we won't go into it too much tonight. But I mention it at the start of this presentation because even though I think tonight's issue is important and have given a fair amount of time to thinking about it, I'd also like to caution against attaching more significance to it than it merits. It might be an odd thing to say at the start of a talk, saying this isn't actually all that important. Well, it is important, but I think we need to put it in context. Quite a few people welcomed Pope Francis's decision last summer to tighten the regulations around the use of the older form of the Mass of the Roman Rite. Quite a few others felt disappointed, angry, or even wounded by it. But despite what you might think from an internet search, the status of the older form of the order of Mass, or the frequency with which it may be celebrated, and where and by whom, is simply not much of an issue of concern for most Catholics. They either aren't aware of the debates and controversies, or they are aware but don't have particularly strong feelings about them. There may well be people in the room tonight from all three categories: those who were pleased with the Pope's letter during the summer, those who weren't, and those who either don't know or don't particularly care. Although you must have cared sufficiently to show up tonight on a cold night. I am one of those who broadly welcomed the Pope's document, but I'm not here to take potshots at those who have a different view. It may well be a matter of indifference for most Catholics, but many of those who do have feelings on the matter feel very strongly indeed, and it's important to be respectful of that. A lot of what passes for discussion of matters like this, particularly online, tends to be vitriolic and pretty un-Christian, and that's hardly what these conversations are meant to be, I presume. So, what has Pope Francis said about the Latin Mass? Well, having just spent a few minutes talking in general before mentioning our title for tonight, we do need to pause again now to clarify what exactly we mean by the term the Latin Mass. It might be obvious to some, but not necessarily to all, so I think it's important to clarify. Latin itself isn't the issue under discussion here, or indeed in the Pope's document from the summer. We all know, for instance, that many churches sing parts of the Mass in Latin to this day, or they sing motets or anthems in Latin, and there's no drama or controversy about it. Hymns like the Veni Creator or the Tantum Ergo or the Salve Regina are routinely sung in Latin without any baggage attached. Now, and I know while my community is hardly typical, my own monastic community in Glenstall does a lot of its praying and singing in Latin, including singing Vespers, evening prayer, every day, entirely in Latin. Since Vatican II, there has never been any restriction on the use of Latin in the Mass. The Mass, as reformed after the Council, may be celebrated in Latin anywhere, by any priest, without any special permission. This has always been the case, and while it might not be a very common occurrence, it does happen. I've experienced it a few times in many different contexts, such as at international gatherings like papal liturgies in Rome. I've celebrated in Latin myself a few times, including once when I was school chaplain and the Leaving Cert Latin class, all three of them, asked me to celebrate Mass for them in Latin one morning as they got near the Leaving Cert. And once, when passing through Krakow airport with a confrere who was determined that we would have Mass, the only missals available were Polish and Latin, so I don't pretend that I have perfect Latin, but it's certainly better than my Polish, so we had Mass in Latin. It's not only at unusual events that one can experience the current form of Mass in Latin. For instance, the main Mass at the Pro Cathedral in Dublin each Sunday, where the famous Palestrina choir sings, is celebrated mostly in Latin, readings in English. When I was a student in Dublin many years ago, I used to go there regularly, and I always found it both intriguing and really encouraging, and actually slightly subversive, that despite the Mass being in Latin and much of the very complex music coming from the Renaissance polyphonic repertoire, active participation by the people present was actually very good indeed. The congregation sang all the responses. They sang the Our Father, and they did all that enthusiastically, much more vigorously, in fact, than most Irish congregations do. And that was Mass in Latin. Even during the summer, when the choir was off, the Mass continued in Latin with an organist and cantor. And the idea of an organist and cantor singing at Mass is probably one of the most typical post-Vatican II images that people have of the liturgy. And there, I did it myself one Sunday when they couldn't get anybody better. And it was just wonderful to be there as the cantor. And we sang the Missa de Angelis, and the people were alternating with me absolutely enthusiastically for the Gloria and the Sanctus and so on, very confidently. It was category-defying, a beautiful, participatory, post-Vatican II liturgy that just happened to be in Latin. So, I'm saying all this because I want to be clear that the Latin Mass referred to in tonight's title is not that. What exactly is being referred to, yet another potential detour, needs to be clarified as well. What is the correct term to use for what we do mean when we say the Latin Mass in this context? As I say, it could get us into a big, long detour, but we'd be here all night, so I'll try to be as concise as possible. You could simply call it the Old Mass. Also, for a long time, it tended to be referred to as the Tridentine Mass, called after the Council of Trent in the 16th century, which led to the revision of the Missal, and so the Mass was often called the Tridentine Mass as a result. Although that terminology seems to have fallen out of fashion. Some people, particularly those who are attached to it, tend to refer to it as the traditional Latin Mass. But that term is actually quite problematic, because it could be seen as suggesting that the post-Vatican II form of Mass, which, as we've noted just a minute ago, can easily be celebrated in Latin, is not traditional, or is not part of what has been handed on, is not part of the tradition. And that would be a deeply heretical thing to say. So calling the Old Mass the traditional Latin Mass is actually a loaded term and not very accurate. There are clearly some people who do think that the new Mass, the so-called Novus Ordo, even though it's 50 years old, some people who believe that is not part of the tradition, but they are wrong. And I think it's a very dangerous line of thinking to be pursuing. In fact, it's the kind of thinking and arguing that probably gave rise to the Pope's letter last July in the first place. Some of those who like the older form like to use titles like the Mass of the Ages, but this kind of language isn't very satisfactory or helpful either. It's very loaded and historically more than slightly questionable. Since a document from Pope Benedict XVI in 2007 that we'll say more about later, the official practice has been to refer to the Mass as celebrated before the Council as the extraordinary form, or more fully, the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite, and the Mass as reformed after Vatican II being referred to simply as the ordinary form. And we'll say more about both of those later. But in fact, it's also arguable that after Pope Francis's letter last July, that this language itself is now obsolete as well, since Francis's most recent document seems to say that there is but one form, not an ordinary form, an extraordinary form, just one form. We'll say more about that later too. Some prefer to simply call it the older use, more commonly using the Latin version of that, usus antiquior. Now, liturgical scholars might argue about the technical differences between a use and a form, but we don't need to get into that now. A rather inelegant but actually very accurate solution might be to refer to it as Mass according to the 1962 Missal. Not a very beautiful term, but it does what it says on the tin, because it was the last version of the Missal issued before Vatican II and the reforms that followed it. So this has been quite a long introduction, I realise, and I hope you haven't fallen asleep yet. But if we are to have a fruitful exploration of Pope Francis's liturgical regulations of last July, we need to be clear what exactly we're talking about. So in summary, we're talking about regulations issued by the Pope governing the use of the 1962 Missal and Masses celebrated according to it. Mass according to that Missal was and still may be celebrated in Latin only, so that's where the Latin Mass shorthand comes from. But that shorthand shouldn't hide the fact that the current form of Mass can be freely celebrated in Latin, and in fact the Pope himself does so regularly. So are you with me so far? Okay, thank you. So the regulations in question are contained in an apostolic letter called Traditionis Custodes, issued by Pope Francis, as I said, last July. And this letter was accompanied by another letter to all the bishops of the world, adding commentary and clarification, in a less formal register, but more bishop-to-bishop sort of letter, as Pope Francis describes it himself, explaining the motives that prompted my decision. It's fair to say that many people were surprised by the Pope's decision, and not a few were horrified, that the Pope had, to quote his second letter, abrogated all the norms, instructions, permissions and customs previously in place around the use of the 1962 Missal. So he did something quite significant. Apart from their dismay at what it meant for those who used the 1962 Missal, there was much comment, particularly again in the media and social media, about the sort of horror of Francis reversing or countermanding the decisions of his predecessors, Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI. Now, it suits a certain agenda to claim that the current pontificate is a great rupture with what has gone before, particularly when Francis's predecessor is still alive and basically living at the end of the garden. Commentators, and not a few ordinary Catholics too, like to suggest that there is a great division between the two men, when in fact nothing that either has ever said or done suggests that there's anything other than affection and respect between them. In this case, in the letter Traditionis Custodes, Francis is indeed reversing some of the provisions made by Pope Emeritus Benedict. However, what you don't hear in all this slightly hysterical commentary is that in the letter that Francis is overriding, Benedict's letter Summorum Pontificum, Benedict himself did exactly the same thing, stating clearly that he was replacing the provisions put in place by Pope John Paul II in his letter Ecclesiae Dei. Sorry for all these Latin-named letters, but anyway, what I'm trying to say is people were getting horrified that Pope Francis changed the rules that had been made by Benedict, whereas in fact Benedict also changed the rules that had been made by John Paul. I think it's really important to keep this in mind. We can learn a lot from history. The shallow level of discourse that characterises the blogosphere seems to be blind to this. So let's look at the history. Pope Paul VI issued a new typical edition of the Roman Missal in 1970. Well, actually, it was Advent 1969, which was the last month of the year, and the liturgical year 1970. It wasn't presented as one optional resource among many. It was the Roman Missal. What he did had happened several times before, a pope promulgating a new liturgical book. Now, it's certainly true that the differences between the 1970 Missal and its immediate predecessor were more marked than those between other editions down the centuries. But that doesn't take from the fact that the action was the same. The Pope produced or published or made public a new book, a new version of a book. I think it would not be unreasonable to suggest that Pope Paul wished the 1970 Missal to replace the Missal of 1962 completely. The formal document at the front of the Missal, the Apostolic Constitution, states pretty clearly, "We wish that these our decrees and prescriptions may be firm and effective now and in the future, notwithstanding to the extent necessary the apostolic constitutions and ordinances issued by our predecessors and other prescriptions, even those deserving particular mention and derogation." Very legalese language, but basically he's saying, I am overriding what my predecessors decreed. Flippantly, you could say, well, that's what popes do. They override things that their predecessors decided. I say flippantly because, well, it is flippant, but there's a truth in it. One of the functions of the episcopal office is to govern, and popes do just that. This sometimes means that they change things that previous popes have decided. They don't change doctrine, of course, they can't alter the deposit of faith, but they can change rules and procedures. This is not a matter of politics or of making one's mark or trying to secure one's place in history. Popes change things in response to the needs of the Church as they see them. Whatever you think of the actual decisions they took, in changing the regulations around the use of the older Missal, Popes John Paul II, Benedict XVI and Francis all said that they were doing so in order to protect the unity of the Church. And the facts, I think, bear this out. They reached different conclusions and they did very different things, but their motivation was the same. It's not surprising that the liturgical reform that followed Vatican II and the Council itself are seen as almost one and the same thing in many people's eyes. The changes in the liturgy were clearly the most obvious and visible changes to follow the Council. There were lots of important documents, document on the Church in the modern world, on ecumenism, on religious freedom, on divine revelation, very important documents. Might be of great interest to theologians, but for most Catholics, the main thing they associate with Vatican II is the liturgy. After all, Vatican II brought the Mass into the vernacular and turned the altars around. Or so people say. The Council itself, of course, didn't actually order either of those things, but in the popular mind, that's the way it was. However, this symbiosis between the Council and the liturgy that emerged from the reform ordered by it is not confined to the popular imagination. Right from the very beginning, opposition to the renewed Roman Missal was tied up with opposition to the outcomes of the Council more generally. They didn't always go together, but they often did. The most obvious example being the late Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre and his followers. Archbishop Lefebvre was actually at the Council, was a Council father, but he rejected the direction it took and indeed many of the decisions it made. He in fact refused to sign the Constitution on the Church in the modern world and the Declaration on Religious Freedom. So not only did he vote against them, but when it came to sort of recording the event, all the bishops were expected to sign, but he refused to sign those two documents. He later described the concept of religious freedom as a horrible apostasy, described ecumenism as adultery, and described the renewed Mass as bastard rites. He went on, as you probably know, to establish a seminary at Econ in Switzerland, forming initially with the local bishop's permission, but soon losing that, a new priestly society, the Society of St. Pius X, often known by the initials SSPX, which rejected the renewed Missal, but also much of the rest of Vatican II as well. In the technical language used in these matters, the Apostolic Constitution accompanying the revised Missal seems to suggest that the new Missal abrogated the previous one. And Pope St. Paul VI himself certainly seems to have thought so. A friend of his, the French philosopher Jean Guiton, wrote that he asked the Pope once, why did he not simply allow Lefebvre and his followers to continue to use the old Missal? Just have a quiet life, let them get on with it, what harm will it do, sort of thing. But his response, at least as recalled by Guiton, was emphatic. Never. This Mass, so-called of St. Pius V, the one we see in Econ, becomes the symbol of the condemnation of the Council. I will not accept, under any circumstances, the condemnation of the Council through a symbol. Should this exception to the liturgy of Vatican II have its way, the entire Council would be shaken. And as a consequence, the apostolic authority of the Council would be shaken. Strong stuff. He felt that conceding the right to continue to use the older rites, two different spellings of the word right there, would be doing more than simply exercising paternal charity towards distressed Catholics who were attached to them, but rather would be legitimizing wholesale rejection of the Second Vatican Council. And this was something he wasn't willing to do. It wasn't an unreasonable position for him to take, I think, given the well-attested views of Archbishop Lefebvre and his followers, some of the examples that I quoted a few minutes ago. Pope Paul VI believed that the unity of the Church would be protected and schism avoided by insisting on the use of the renewed Missal only. Following developments over the following 20 years, Pope St. John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI came to a different viewpoint. The much-feared schism did indeed happen, and Pope John Paul adopted a new pastoral approach in an effort to heal that division. Interestingly, Pope Benedict, who continued with that approach, also came to a different view on the question of whether the Missal of 1962 had in fact been abrogated in 1970. And in Summorum Pontificum, he stated that it had not. We'll say more about that later too. I think it's important to do this historical tour and to continue with it and to continue to look at the twists and turns that led to the various papal interventions, statements and regulations regarding the Missal of 1962, because we can't really understand what Pope Francis has done in this regard without understanding that backstory. Demonstrating that Pope Paul's intuition that rejection of the Missal indicated a greater rejection of the Council itself was well-founded. Lefebvre declared in 1974, "We hold fast with all our heart and with all our soul to Catholic Rome, guardian of the Catholic faith and of the traditions necessary to preserve this faith, to eternal Rome, mistress of wisdom and truth. We refuse, on the other hand, and have always refused to follow the Rome of neo-modernist and neo-Protestant tendencies, which were clearly evident in the Second Vatican Council and after the Council in all the reforms which issued from it." So absolute, total rejection of everything that the Council did and led to. Lefebvre was suspended from exercising priestly ministry by Pope Paul in 1976 after ordaining students from his seminary at Icon against the express instructions of the Holy See. Of course, he carried on his ministry and continued ordaining priests regardless, and the Society now has members and churches throughout the world, including here in Cork, as well as in Dublin, Athlone, Belfast and Newry. The Society continued for some years in this irregular status of not operating licitly in Rome's eyes, but still not formally excommunicated either. And in 1984, the Congregation for Divine Worship, in a circular called Quatuor ab hinc annos, noted that a survey of the bishops of the world in 1980, 4 years ago, that being the reason for the name, Quatuor ab hinc annos, showed that, quote, "the problem of priests and faithful holding to the so-called Tridentine rite was almost completely solved." They got that wrong. It's interesting, though, that it was described as a problem. The outcome was that since the problem still wasn't fully solved, the Pope was giving bishops the right, under certain circumstances, to permit groups who petitioned for it to celebrate according to the 1962 Missal. It's notable that this so-called indult required that it be made publicly clear beyond all ambiguity that such priests and their respective faithful in no way shared the positions of those who call in question the legitimacy and doctrinal exactitude of the Roman Missal promulgated by Pope Paul VI in 1970. So he was willing to allow more people have permission to use the old Missal as long as they weren't denying the validity and the appropriate place in the Church of the revised one. This was an acknowledgement, of course, that some of those who wished to use the older Missal did actively reject the Reformed rites, sometimes to the point of actually rejecting their sacramental efficacy, saying the Mass wasn't actually valid anymore. So John Paul's indult was not aimed at placating such people, but at those who sought to use the 1962 Missal on spiritual grounds alone. He was trying to hold as many people as he could within the embrace of the Church. And that was, I think, a very brave and sincere attempt to limit the damage being done, to limit the level of division. The problem, of course, was that Archbishop Lefebvre was precisely the category of person, the kind of devotee of the traditional Mass that was expressly not covered by the indult. Of course, everyone gets older, and as he grew older and more infirm, in 1987, Lefebvre announced that he would consecrate another member of the Society as a bishop, because he wanted to be able to guarantee the future of his fraternity. And of course, bishops can only be consecrated with the mandate of the Pope, and so this was problematic. Both Pope John Paul II and indeed his successor, the then Cardinal Prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, made huge efforts to dissuade the Archbishop from taking this step. And in fact, an outline agreement was reached by Archbishop Lefebvre and Cardinal Ratzinger, but the Archbishop subsequently announced that he was not going to go through with the agreement and was going to go ahead with the consecration as planned. So Cardinal Ratzinger then wrote to him, again asking him not to do so. Pope John Paul himself wrote to him directly, begging him to avoid such a schismatic act, and he got no reply. And in June 1988, the Archbishop consecrated not one but 4 members of the SSPX as bishops. Thereby Lefebvre, the 4 new bishops, and the bishop who assisted in the consecrations all incurred the penalty of excommunication automatically. It had been a long time coming, 18 years. John Paul and Cardinal Ratzinger had all tried hard to avoid it, but sadly it came to pass. Just days later, I think 2 days later, Pope John Paul issued the apostolic letter Ecclesia Dei. This was a short and immediate response to what had happened at Icon, which the Pope said the Church had learned about with great affliction. And he continued, this affliction was particularly felt by the successor of Peter, to whom in the first place pertains the guardianship of the unity of the Church. He clearly states that the consecrations were a schismatic act and that those involved have incurred excommunication. But he goes on to analyse what he thinks is the cause of the phenomenon. The root of this schismatic act can be discerned in an incomplete and contradictory notion of tradition. Incomplete because it does not take sufficiently into account the living character of tradition. But especially contradictory is a notion of tradition which opposes the universal magisterium of the Church possessed by the Bishop of Rome and the body of bishops. It is impossible to remain faithful to the tradition while breaking the ecclesial bond with him to whom, in the person of the Apostle Peter, Christ himself entrusted the ministry of unity in his Church. So you can say you're traditional if you're not going to be in communion with the Pope, is what he was saying to them. Some of the most trenchant traditionalist critics of Pope Francis nowadays, to me at least, seem to come perilously close to breaking that particular bond as well. And they might do well to look at their consciences, but again, that's another evening's talk. However, the principal focus of the document was not to attack Archbishop Lefebvre or his followers. It was a call to unity and an appeal to those followers to return to the fold. In doing so, Pope John Paul was reaching out to them by offering them the possibility of continuing to worship according to the older rites while still remaining within the full communion of the Church. So it has moved. Pope Paul VI was saying, no way, there is now a missal and that's it. It didn't work that way. Lots of people still wanted to use the old missal. Some of them had now placed themselves outside the communion of the Church, and Pope John Paul said, please stay within the Church and I'll let you use the older missal. Slightly simplified version, but that's effectively the dynamic of what was going on. And he explicitly asked for the support of the bishops and all those engaged in pastoral ministry around the world in facilitating the aspirations of those who were attached to the earlier rites and wished to remain in the communion of the Church. Set up a commission and office in the Curia to be the point of contact and coordination for those efforts, so-called Ecclesia Dei Commission after the document. And he expanded on the provisions of that Quatuor Apink Annos letter, or at least urged those who might have been slow in responding to that by stating that respect must everywhere be shown for the feelings of all those who are attached to the Latin liturgical tradition by a wide and generous application of the directives already issued some time ago by the Apostolic See for the use of the Roman Missal according to the typical edition of 1962. Basically, he asked for a more wide and generous permission to be given by bishops around the world for the use of the older liturgy. Those two documents from Pope St. John Paul's pontificate, Quatuor Apink Annos from the Congregation for Divine Worship and Ecclesia Dei from the Pope himself, are very important, I would say. Any perceived liberalisation or permission to celebrate the pre-Vatican II Mass was not an episode in the so-called liturgy wars that have often plagued the Church. It wasn't a rejection or even a critique of the 1970 Missal, as it is sometimes painted by some people. We all know that there were, as there still are, many contested issues regarding the liturgy since the Conciliar Reform, and Rome has issued several instructions over the last 50 years to address some of those issues. But John Paul's opening up of slightly more widespread permission for celebrations according to the 1962 Missal was not one of those instructions. It was an effort to promote communion, to protect communion, a pastoral and paternal reaching out towards children of the Church who were on the brink of schism. Ecclesia Dei even ends with the poignant words from chapter 17 of St. John's Gospel, that they all may be one. Excuse me. Efforts at building bridges with the SSPX have continued intermittently since then. Catholics of a more progressive cast of mind have not always appreciated or valued the seriousness with which the various popes have attempted to heal that schism. Pope Benedict in particular devoted a lot of effort to the task, some of which sadly came back to bite him later. His biggest gesture was the apostolic letter Summorum Pontificum of 2007. And he made it clear in writing that letter that he is developing on those two documents from John Paul II in seeking to provide for those attached to the Missal of 1962. In doing so, he came up with a theological formulation that took many by surprise and which many sincere and not necessarily ultra-liberal liturgical scholars and theologians actually find quite difficult to embrace. The Latin maxim lex orandi, lex credendi has been an important value in liturgical thinking for many centuries. And it's important too for understanding what Benedict decreed in that letter, Summorum Pontificum. So it says that the law or the rule of what is prayed establishes the law or rule of what is believed. As we pray, so we believe. In Summorum Pontificum, Benedict taught, the Roman Missal promulgated by Pope Paul VI is the ordinary expression of the lex orandi, the rule of prayer, of the Catholic Church of the Latin Rite. The Roman Missal promulgated by St. Pius V and revised by John XXIII is nonetheless to be considered an extraordinary expression of the same lex orandi of the Church and duly honoured for its venerable ancient usage. These two expressions of the Church's lex orandi will in no way lead to a division in the Church's lex credendi, its rule of faith, for they are two usages of the one Roman rite. So from this comes the language of ordinary form and extraordinary form that has been in use for the last 15 years. So those who read this document in a sort of a maximalist way will argue that it gives the two missals almost equivalent status, while those less given to flights of fancy, I would suggest, will point out that the ordinary form is by definition normative. It is ordinary, it is the usual normal one, and the extraordinary form is in no way equivalent to it. Benedict also stated that the 1962 Missal was never abrogated, and in providing new rules for its use, explicitly states that he's overriding and replacing the provisions of John Paul's Quatuor Apinc Annos and Ecclesia Dei. And it's interesting, of course, that his replacing of provisions made by his predecessor seems to have drawn a lot less outrage than Francis doing so 14 years later. Pope Benedict's changes were certainly quite revolutionary. Basically, he removed almost all restrictions on the use of the 1962 Missal. Any priest could now use it any time, apart from the Triduum when he needed permission. And pastors were expected to provide extraordinary form masses in parishes where a stable group of faithful attached to it existed. Weddings and baptisms and other sacraments could also be freely celebrated using the older books. Bishops could set up extraordinary form parishes. It was certainly more than generous. Almost immediately, this decision was instrumentalized and even weaponized by people on both extremes of the Church. Some of those who disliked it claimed that Benedict was denying Vatican II and rolling back the reforms it mandated. Some of those who were pleased with it spoke in very emotive terms about the true liturgy having been liberated. Many of them agreed with their opponents, that Summorum Pontificum was Benedict's judgment on the renewed liturgy. He had, after all, as a cardinal, written quite critically about some of the post-conciliar reforms, so this fed that image. However, the document itself avoids all such commentary and is explicitly cast as a pastoral response to those who were attached to the older form. And I'm inclined to think we should take him at his word. Benedict issued a letter to the bishops of the world along with the formal apostolic letter, specifically addressing some of the inevitable misconceptions and misrepresentations. And he explicitly denies that the document detracts from the authority of Vatican II or that the liturgical reform was being called into question. In stating, however, that the earlier missal was never formally abrogated, he suggests, correctly in my view, that it was never felt necessary to do so, because it was expected that the numbers of those attached to it were small and would soon disappear. Basically, that it was only older people and that in time they would go to worship in the heavenly choirs. So, but also, it was never abrogated in the sense of being declared no longer valid, because doing that would have been dangerous, because it could be suggesting that the church actually hadn't had a valid Eucharist for a couple of hundred years. So it was never going to be abrogated in that sense of being totally shut down and said we can't use this because it's not valid. It couldn't have been declared no longer valid. That would have undone, would have been preposterous and absurd. So on this basis, the argument that the 1962 Missal had never been juridically abrogated seems to me to be a bit thin. It's a technicality. However, it is true, and the fact that the 1962 Missal was therefore always technically licit allowed Benedict to widen permission for its use without rejecting the reform. He was clear that his widening of permission for the 1962 Missal was not aimed at council deniers like the SSPX. He's also clear that what we might call the expected twilighting out of the extraordinary form as its devotees died was not going to happen anytime soon, as new and younger people discovered the older liturgical forms. And this was certainly an important and significant development. He dismissed fears that wider permission for the older form would create divisions in parishes. On this, I think he was somewhat naively optimistic. I think it's one of the reasons that Pope Francis has decided as he has. Another concept introduced by Pope Benedict in the accompanying letter to the bishops was that of mutual enrichment, that the two forms of the one Roman rite could enrich each other. It's a lovely sounding concept, but I would question the basis for it. If the idea was that the older form was somehow more sacral or transcendent, and that its coexistence with the post-1970 liturgy would somehow kind of rub off on it and make it holier or more sacred, then it's not hard to see how some would take this as the Pope actually saying that the newer Mass was somehow lacking. And of course, that's just what many people did come to say and used his words to make that claim. It would, in fact, be more coherent to actually amend the rubrics of the renewed liturgy or formally prescribe the reintroduction of certain ceremonies or actions than to state a vague hope that some of these things might reappear in the ordinary form almost by osmosis. In fact, in suggesting what he was doing, the Pope could actually have been seen to be promoting the kind of personal taste experimentation and imposition of personal preferences that many would argue has been one of the biggest problems of the post-Vatican II liturgy, ironically. The other half of Benedict's mutual enrichment argument was that the Reformed liturgy should enrich the 1962 Missal too. That those who use... Now, and I think this is very shaky ground. There's some sense to it, obviously, that those who use the older books should be able to do things like celebrate saints canonized after 1962 is certainly logical. Lots of people who use the Old Mass would be very happy to have a feast of Mother Teresa or a feast of Pope John Paul II, for instance, and of course they aren't in the Old Missal. However, it creates a very anomalous situation. The Pope was effectively calling for the Missal of 1962 to be updated. And you might say, well, what's the problem with that? The problem, I think, is that the updating of the Missal of 1962 took place in 1970. The updated Missal of 1962 is the 1970 Missal. And that's a fact, whether one likes the result or not. So, and with things now being added to the 1962 Missal for good reasons, such as new saints or amendments to the Good Friday prayers to replace one that's considered, that is offensive and anti-Semitic, it's almost as if the liturgical reform is being commenced again, albeit in less radical terms and at a slower pace. That you're starting to reform the Missal again when it has been, but starting with an old one rather than starting with the one now. There's something incoherent about this that I think is unsatisfactory. There's logic for it, but there's deep logical holes in it too, I think. Both Pope Benedict and Pope Francis continued Pope John Paul's efforts to bring about reconciliation with the followers of Archbishop Lefebvre. In 2009, Pope Benedict formally remitted or lifted the sentences of excommunication against the 4 illicitly consecrated bishops. Now, this didn't actually mean they were now recognized as bishops of the church. They were still suspended and they were irregular, but there was a huge symbolic gesture in lifting the excommunication. He suffered a lot of backlash for this. Well, one, for doing it, and two, because almost immediately after he had done it, it emerged that one of the four, Richard Williamson, was a Holocaust denier and possessed of all kinds of unsavoury views. The Pope clearly wasn't briefed very well, and the storm generated by this, with the sort of unpleasant innuendo that his remittance of the excommunication was a sign that he somehow shared this odious man's odious views, sort of lingered, and that could have been avoided if he had been advised better, but it happened. During the Jubilee of Mercy in 2015, I found this very interesting at the time. Pope Francis gave permission for Catholics to go to confession licitly and validly to SSPX priests. And subsequently, at the end of the Jubilee of Mercy, he actually renewed that faculty indefinitely. Similarly, a year or two later, in 2017, he allowed for SSPX priests to celebrate the weddings of Catholics in certain circumstances. So there have been lots of overtures, discussions, draft agreements over the years, the details of which are for another night. But I mention these few headline items because this impetus to bring about reconciliation with the SSPX has been a constant in the history of the Pope's decisions and provisions around the use of the pre-Vatican II Roman Missal. I mention them also because it's important to note that this was not just a preoccupation of the more traditionalist-friendly Pope Benedict, but it's also been an important consideration for Pope Francis. Notwithstanding my own reservations about Summorum Pontificum and the explanatory letter that accompanied it, and me challenging the great Joseph Ratzinger, the irony isn't lost on me, I read one comment recently which I think is very accurate. This is an academic from Notre Dame in America, said, "In granting the permissions in Summorum Pontificum, Pope Benedict very clearly wished to sever the link between preconciliar liturgy and anti-conciliar theology, a problem no one can doubt he takes gravely seriously." So he wanted to separate this idea of people attached to the old Mass reject everything in Vatican II. He wanted to treat the liturgy as an item on its own. I think that is a fair comment. I think that Francis takes it gravely seriously too, and would suggest that this is his principal motivation in saying what he is saying about the older form of the Mass. So, as you begin to nod off, wondering, is he ever going to stop? Well, in fact, is he ever going to start and tell us what did Pope Francis say about the Latin Mass? I better get there. The first thing I would observe is that despite his reputation for loquacity and for saying lots of things off the cuff and lots of things to reporters and on planes and so on, in this case he actually hasn't said very much. Traditionis Custodes is not a long document. As is typical in these kinds of documents, and notwithstanding many commentators' desire to cast him in the role of a great disruptor, he's careful to set his revised prescriptions in the context of what he calls the paternal solicitude and the desire to promote the concord and unity of the Church, which also motivated Popes John Paul II and Benedict XVI in Ecclesia Dei and Summorum Pontificum. Just as Benedict had invited the bishops of the world to report to him after 3 years' experience of Summorum Pontificum, in 2020, Francis had asked the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith to carry out a further survey of the bishops in the light of experience that has matured during these years. He was clearly keen to get a sense, or to give a sense in the document of continuity and harmony rather than rupture. He says that the consultation of the world's bishops informed the decisions he has taken. Skeptics and some anti-Francis activists seem to be unable to take him at his word and have demanded that he publish the results of this consultation, with the not-so-subtle inference that he's not being truthful in saying what he's saying. Well, the most polite thing I can say in response to that is that it is a pretty big deal for a Catholic to accuse the Pope of lying in an apostolic letter, and one should think and pray pretty deeply before doing so. He prefaces the actual norms in the letter by stating that, "I now desire with this apostolic letter to press on evermore in the constant search for ecclesial communion." I think this is a sentence that bears reflecting on. Many commentators, both those who are delighted by the new regulations and those who are horrified by them, have tended to speak of Francis having reined in the traditionalists, or having put them back in their box, or having punished them despite their fidelity to the Holy See. But as I've suggested with regard to his two immediate predecessors, it's important to take the Pope at his word when it comes to understanding his motivation. He felt that he needed to change the rules around the Missal of 1962 in order to protect and enhance ecclesial communion, the relationships that signify the unity of the Church. Many people may well feel that he's gone about it in the wrong way. Time will tell, and Pope Francis has never been one to discourage debate. But I do think that it is important to accept his stated motivation. I said earlier that in the face of popes changing rules and regulations, one could say jocosely, that's what popes do. But in this case, I say that's what popes do much more seriously and intentionally. Popes acting to build up and protect the communion of the Church, avoiding schism and division, that most certainly is what popes do. And in fact, if they didn't do that, there'd be little point in having them. So what has he said about the Mass itself? The first point is very important and significant theologically. He says very straight, the liturgical books promulgated by St. Paul VI and St. John Paul II, in conformity with the decrees of Vatican Council II, are the unique expression of the lex orandi of the Roman Rite. In saying this, he seems to be repudiating the idea of ordinary and extraordinary form of one rite, introduced by Pope Benedict, and is saying instead that there is but one form of the Roman Rite. He's saying, though not explicitly, that there is no parity between the missals of 1962 and 1970, and that therefore permission to use the Missal of 1962 is a concession rather than an automatic right. In view of the fact that permission to use the 1962 Missal is not automatic, he declares that it is up to the diocesan bishop to decide where and when it may be celebrated, and that it's not just down to being a matter of the personal preference of the individual priest, which had become a feature in some parts of the world and which has indeed led to division in parish communities. He prescribes that the priest designated to celebrate for groups attached to the older forms needs to be proficient in Latin. Hardly controversial if you're going to say Mass in Latin, I guess. But somewhat more controversially, that the readings must be in the vernacular. Shouldn't be that controversial, but it is to some people. And critics have taken some delight in pointing out that as it stands, there's no problem with having the readings in Latin at Masses during the Masses that use the current Missal. You could even have Mass in English with readings in Latin with no problem, but you can't have readings in Latin at Mass using the 1962 Missal. And that is indeed a legitimate criticism, and I think it's an editing error that should have been fixed at proofreading stage. Another thing which is clearly a change is that Francis does not see the older form of Mass as something sort of mainstream in the same way that Benedict did in his regulations. I say this because while bishops are to make suitable provision for existing groups of devotees of the 1962 Missal, he is, and it says quite clearly, to take care not to authorize the establishment of new groups. So he's not looking for this to be a missionary endeavor, to be a strategy for growth. You serve those who are already worshippers according to that tradition, but you don't set up new groups. Any new priests ordained after this document was published, they need to have the bishop's permission to use the old Missal, and somewhat surprisingly, the bishop must consult Rome before granting it. So this would seem to suggest that the Pope wants such permissions to be granted sparingly. Combined with the injunction not to allow new groups to be set up, it does seem that Pope Francis is following more closely the stance adopted after the new Missal was first published, of allowing the older form on a largely temporary or provisional basis as a concession to those attached to it, with a view to it becoming less prevalent rather than more prevalent and eventually largely dying out. Some have asked why he would want to do that and have imputed all sorts of malevolent intentions to him. But the fact is that this is what was envisaged when the Fathers of the Second Vatican Council mandated the reform and renewal of the Missal. Many critics point out that the reforms went much further than the Council Fathers intended, and that things like the almost total adoption of fully vernacular Masses, Mass facing the people, the decline of the use of Latin, the decline of Gregorian chant and so on, were never envisaged by the Council, and many of those criticisms have truth and are undeniable. But something that's also undeniable is that the Council did not expect that there would be two different Missals in use after the Reform. The Missal was to be reformed and renewed, and what would emerge then would be the missal. That makes sense? So the option to use an earlier version was not envisaged, as the new missal would become, as Pope Francis put it, the unique expression of the lex orandi of the Roman Rite. So it's logical then to seek to limit use of the older form, as I say, primarily as a merciful gesture towards those who sincerely desire to use it, but at the same time not promoting it or seeking to widen its use. Some more extreme fans of the Reform have gone so far as to suggest that if the renewed missal is the unique expression of the rule of prayer of the Roman Rite, maybe the older form should not be permitted at all, since it presumably is no longer an expression of the lex credendi. I think this is an extreme and unhelpful perspective, and that forbidding the older form entirely would be completely inappropriate. The language of the Pope's letter is open to interpretation, though, and he would do well, I think, to clarify it at some stage soon. So Benedict had said that the Reformed Missal was the ordinary expression of the lex credendi. Francis says it's the unique one. Both of these formulations have problems going with them for different reasons, and I think that more work needs to be done on elucidating this very sensitive point. Francis's accompanying letter to the bishops of the world is longer than the apostolic letter itself and amplifies some of what he says. And some of what he says in it is very strong indeed. Speaking of the responses to the survey that he asked the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith to conduct last year, he says, "The responses reveal a situation that preoccupies and saddens me and persuades me of the need to intervene. Regrettably, the pastoral objective of my predecessors, who had intended to do everything possible to ensure that all those who truly possess the desire for unity would find it possible to remain in this unity or to rediscover it anew, has often been seriously disregarded. An opportunity offered by St. John Paul II, and with even greater magnanimity by Benedict XVI, intended to recover the unity of an ecclesial body with diverse liturgical sensibilities, was exploited to widen the gaps, reinforce the divergences, and encourage disagreements that injure the Church, block her path, and expose her to the peril of division." Pretty strong stuff. He's not saying that his predecessors were wrong. He's saying they did something good, holy, and generous, and it has been abused. He balances this by quoting Benedict's sorrow at the sometimes unbearable distortions experienced when the new liturgy is celebrated, but continues saying, "I am nonetheless saddened that the instrumental use of the Missale Romanum of 1962 is often characterized by a rejection not only of the liturgical reform, but of the Vatican Council II itself, claiming with unfounded and unsustainable assertions that it betrayed the tradition and the true Church." And he goes on then to quote the Council's own Constitution and Divine Revelation in speaking about the dynamic of tradition, before concluding the section in quite a rhetorical flourish with, "To doubt the Council is to doubt the intentions of those very fathers who exercised their collegial power in a solemn manner, cum Petro et sub Petro," with Peter and under Peter, in an ecumenical council, and in the final analysis, to doubt the Holy Spirit himself who guides the Church. Many people were shocked by this analysis and by the Pope's linking of adherence to the older liturgy with rejection of the Council. It might have been better if he had stated explicitly that this was not a blanket judgment against all those who desire to celebrate using the older missal, because I think if it were more obvious that he wasn't condemning all of them, his message would have been less obscured by the many voices that have been speaking out about how upsetting they found the Pope's words. We have seen, however, that there is indeed a strong current of reactionary ideology attaching to identifying with the older form. It's not an exact parallel, but it's there. You'll recall that Pope Paul saw it as a symbol of the rejection of the Council. So Francis isn't saying anything new by mentioning it now. I'm nearly there. One can expect that certain bishops who like to act almost as courtiers, I'm thinking of people like Cardinal Cupich of Chicago, who can be relied on to always issue a statement saying how much he agrees with what the Pope says on this, or indeed any issue. He always likes to come in with a "me too, I'm the Pope's best friend" sort of statement. So when he says things approving of what the Pope says, I don't get too surprised, because he always does. But I was surprised to read comments by the American Dominican Archbishop Agustin de Noia about Traditionis Custodes. Now, Agustin Noia is no courtier or yes-man. He's been a senior official in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and the Congregation for Divine Worship, and also indeed in the Ecclesia Dei Commission, so he was involved in the negotiations with Archbishop Lefebvre's people. And he'd be fairly conservative in his general attitude to the world, I think. Far from saying that Francis was harsh in his treatment of traditionalists, with whom he has a lot of experience working, or in his characterization of them in the letter to the bishops, de Noia gave an interview saying that the Pope quote, fearlessly hits the nail on the head. The traditional Latin Mass movement has hijacked the initiatives of St. John Paul II and Benedict XVI to its own ends. He went on to say that what we've got now is a movement within the Church herself, seemingly endorsed by her leaders, that sows division by undermining the reforms of the Second Vatican Council through the rejection of the most important of them, the reform of the Roman Rite. The thing has gotten totally out of control and become a movement, especially in the US, France and England. A movement that aggressively promotes the traditional Latin Mass among young people and others as if this extraordinary form were the true liturgy for the true Church. Very strong words indeed from Archbishop de Noia. The Pope moves from his own negative appraisal of the link between traditionalism and rejection of conciliar reform to the decision to reverse some of the permissions granted by his predecessors. He says, ever more plain in the words and attitudes of many is the close connection between the choice of celebrations according to the liturgical books prior to Vatican Council II and the rejection of the Church and her institutions in the name of what is called the true Church. So de Noia was, I think, paraphrasing the Pope in his very strong statement. The Pope goes on saying, one is dealing here with comportment that contradicts communion and nurtures the divisive tendency. I belong to Paul, I belong instead to Apollo, I belong to Cephas, I belong to Christ, against which the Apostle Paul so vigorously reacted. In defense of the unity of the body of Christ, I am constrained to revoke the faculty granted by my predecessors. In defense of the unity of the body of Christ, that's why I'm doing it. So that's what he has said, and that's what he has done. He's revoked the widespread permission for use of the Missal of 1962, granted by his predecessors, and he has said why. It would be easy, as I've said a few times over the course of this talk, to characterize this as a sign of discontinuity and rupture with his predecessors, as a sign almost of apostasy in the face of their fidelity, and I have read commentary that uses those kind of words. It would be easy to do that, but it would be lazy and it would be completely inaccurate. And since we're in a Dominican house, I'll leave the last words to a Dominican, going back to Archbishop de Noia. He says, the decisive point is there for all to behold. The evident and ongoing betrayal of the intentions of the two pontiffs who permitted the celebration of the 1962 Missal to draw traditionalists back into the unity of the Church. What the Holy Father is saying is that the Latin Mass movement is working for objectives that are precisely contrary to what St. John Paul and Benedict XVI hoped for. The way to address abuses is not by adopting the extraordinary form, but by promoting the true renewal of the liturgy, which in many places has simply not happened. This renewal is not a matter of creatively ignoring the rubrics, but finding the true spirit of the liturgical reform by mining the riches of the Word of God, which have now been made available both in the vastly expanded cycles of the lectionary and the divine office, and celebrating the Mass with absolute fidelity to the text and rubrics and to its proper nature as a participation in the celestial worship of Christ for the Father with the communion of saints. Amen. Thank you. Crikey. Oh, I'll sit and have a glass of water.
Thank you, Martin.
Pleasure.
Thank you so very much. I thought I had followed the debates, the issues, that I understood what was at stake. And I found how shallow my own reading of it was. I'm so grateful to Martin for filling in the backstory for us and for situating what appears to be debate about rubrics within the great task of ensuring the unity of the body of Christ. Martin is willing to take questions and to take part in a conversation, But it might be useful for us first to allow him have a breather, and we'll have a few minutes of a stretch break. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, as I said, I certainly have been immensely enriched by hearing of the theological journey involved, which has led to the decision made by Pope Francis. So I'm sure other people have topics they would like to put forward, questions, conversations, observations. The floor is open.
Excuse my ignorance, but could you explain to us what the 1962 missal was?
Yeah. So even though people speak about the Tridentine Rite, as in the Council of Trent, and the liturgy was reformed after Trent by Pope Pius V, there were lots of small reforms along the way. And the last one of those reforms before Vatican II was actually by John XXIII in 1962. So when they were allowing people to use the old missal, they were allowing them to use the most recent old missal. And that included stuff that had been done in the 1950s to renew the Holy Week rites, for instance, by Pope Pius XII, when the Holy Week was totally revised and brought back into what would be considered logical time. So you have the Easter Vigil by night rather than Saturday morning, and so on. So all those things various things had been happening since 1570. Because again, even though these people often speak about the Mass of the Ages as if it was sort of came down from heaven in a tablet of stone, it has always been revised and slightly, and new saints added, for instance. And so the last revision before the major revision following the council was in 1962.
And it was in Latin, was it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Was it anything to do with the fact that it was called for the lay people and the kingdom of heaven? Because I happen to have a 1962 version.
All right. Yeah, well, I want to see as part of what was going on generally in the church at that period with the liturgical movement, there was a lot of production of small hand missals with parallel Latin and English, and that all fed towards the desire then to have celebrations in vernacular languages. There were some places where there had been some experimentation before the council, in fact, allowing other languages to be used, but on a very limited basis. But you find now too, I was talking there a minute ago about the reference to 1962 is important, I think, actually, because sometimes you find that those who get one concession, then that becomes a bit more mainstream and they want to do something more exotic. So there's quite a few places now, including a Benedictine monastery that was founded in France a couple of years ago by an Englishman, that now has gone back to celebrating Holy Week according to the version before Pope Pius XII, and are delighted to be having the Easter Vigil at 8 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, and lighting the fire to shatter the darkness of this night, the sun splitting the rocks. I just find that very strange, because that's not about holding on to something that has been spiritually nourishing for you for generations. That just sounds like being difficult for the sake of being difficult to me, I have to say. There's no nice way of putting it, and I'm embarrassed now because I've been filmed saying it. But I wonder about that sort of dynamic. I always want to... It's sort of exoticism rather than anything else, which is not a good basis on which to build one's spiritual life.
An altar boy celebrating the Easter thing in the early morning, you know, and
the night
all
time.
in Latin.
Yeah.
And I have read over the past couple of years serious attempts by some of the modern day traditionalists to argue how doing it in the morning is actually better. and that we've become far too literal-minded and rational by insisting on doing it at night time. And you think, no, that's just willful ordinariness. Now, that is a minority. And getting back to what I was saying earlier at the very start about the sort of the blogosphere and the Twittersphere, a lot of these people who have these very bizarre ideas actually have a lot more prominence than they probably deserve, and there are actually a lot fewer of them than you would think if you by searching the internet, because they tend to be loud and well resourced. There's lots of people who prefer to go to Mass in the old rite and just do so quietly and don't make any drama about it. But there are a lot of very active activists, and it's very hard sometimes to understand what exactly their motivation is.
When did Mass in the vernacular actually come in?
With the 1970, when the Missal of 19, slightly inaccurate. I was going to say with the Missal of 1970, but in fact there was sort of interim versions. Immediately it was allowed for by the council. There were sort of experimental versions, and there was sort of a kind of interim thing that was pretty much like the old Mass but in English, or at least, so I say in English here, obviously in other languages, in other places. And I forget, Pope Paul VI celebrated the first Mass in Italian, at least the first officially recognised and allowed Mass in Italian, and I think, it's probably in the mid-60s. But that was before the rites had been fully reformed, but just they began celebrating in other languages. But again, that becomes contested too, because the Constitution and the Liturgy of Vatican II still says that Latin is the language of the Church and is to be preserved. It sort of presumes that every priest will be fluent in Latin. Now, I don't think there's ever been a time in history when every priest was fluent in Latin. And so permission for introduction of the vernacular was piecemeal. Readings first. Often in the past, the readings were read sort of before the sermon from the pulpit in English, separate from, they were read in, or muttered in Latin during the Mass, and then they were sort of read again then in the vernacular before the sermon. Then in time they began to be read in the vernacular as part of the liturgy. And I think the Eucharistic prayer was the last bit that was permitted to be celebrated, to be said in vernacular languages. I think most of it, the rest of it could be. The Gloria and so on was allowed, but the actual Eucharistic prayer was the last to be permitted. But by the time 1970 came, it was all very fast. By the time 1970 came and the revised Missal was produced, it was all translated into vernacular languages.
362, even the readings were in Latin.
Yes, they were in Latin, and even now. The priest has to read them in Latin. Well, the Pope has now said that he can't, but up until he's said that they must, it would often be the case that they would be read in Latin by the priest during Mass, and on a Sunday then, so at a low Mass during a week, you wouldn't ever hear the readings at all in English. If you were at a Mass on Sunday with a sermon, he might then read them in English from the pulpit just before he did the sermon. I think that's, I know there's people here who I'm speaking from very little experience. Some people here probably have the experience.
I have a memory of being here in Cork as a young fella in the early 70s, and when the new order had come in and the English translation of it, Bishop Lucy had a different version for quite a long time.
He did his own translation?
Yes.
Right.
He was a kind of a Gallican. He believed that the decrees of a council took effect in a diocese only when the bishop decided so. Which was very interesting.
Independent Republic of Cork?
Yeah.
There was a thing called the Dialogue Mass.
Yeah.
At one stage before the Latin Mass came in, I think, or before the English.
Yeah, because it was considered a novelty because I think if in lots of places the server would have done all the bits that were supposed to be done by the people. So he would answer Mass, as they used to say. He didn't so much serve Mass as he answered Mass, and so the people didn't actually participate in the responses at all. So one of the interim things, again, as a result of the general movement towards, part of the liturgical movement in the middle of the 20th century, the idea of the dialogue mass. It was probably quite revolutionary, but it sounds a bit daft now. You'd say, well, isn't it obvious that if there's a response of Amen, that the people should actually say it? But they didn't, actually, in most cases. All the responding was done by the server. Yes, I remember, I've only been at a handful of celebrations according to the older rite in my life. But one of them was during the Eucharistic Congress a few years ago in Dublin. It was about 10 years ago now, was it? And a Canadian Archbishop celebrated Pontifical High Mass. So I was in Dublin and I thought, this could be interesting. I've never experienced Pontifical High Mass, so I went to it. And a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. When it came to the Our Father, I began singing along lustily, and I nearly got the head taken off me by everybody around me because I wasn't supposed to. And there was various responses that I was making because I knew them, because again I was used to going to the modern Mass in Latin occasionally, so from my days going to the Pro Cathedral in Dublin, so I thought I knew all this stuff. I know the responses, this is great. And so in the preface dialogue, I was shouting out the responses back at the bishop, and didn't go down terribly well. And in some of those celebrations, you had a very strange thing where even it could be a big solemn celebration with a choir, but the celebrant would still do his thing. So you could have the Gloria, and the celebrant would sit there and say it, mutter it quietly while the choir were singing it. And he could have moved on by the time they'd have finished singing their verse. And likewise during the Eucharistic prayer, when they would sing the Sanctus, he would be saying it, but of course he'd be finished it. If there's a big fancy choral event, he'd be finished saying it long before they'd be finished singing it. So he would continue with the Eucharistic prayer. That's one of the reasons we ended up with bells, so people would know where they were. And then they would, the second bit, the Benedictus, the Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, would be sung after the consecration. So the bells helped you kind of place yourself, because he was doing one thing and they were doing another. And even now in some of those celebrations, where they've been forced to have readings in the vernacular, you might have a subdeacon or somebody reading them in the vernacular, but the celebrant could be reading them in Latin at the same time. It's the idea of participation at a very basic level, responding, seems pretty second nature to us, and we're not great in this country at singing in church and doing lots of other things, but we're able to say Amen. And it's second nature that you would. But it wasn't always so, and so it's a strange sort of. It's so beyond our experience now that it sounds comical, but it made sense on its terms, because the priest literally said the Mass. He said all of it. And so as long as it had the priest and the man to answer him, you didn't need a whole lot else.
I'd like just to say thank you very much for a very, comprehensive explanation of where we came from in Vatican II to the present day. I wouldn't have understood the intricacies or the minor points that yet add up to where we've come to today. I'm just drawn to one or two things though. One, there was a big song and dance there about 5 or 6 years, maybe longer I suppose now. They bring in consubstantial when we were saying the creed at Mass, because that was a throwback to the Latin, and that it captured in some way a better sense of what we were about. And we got all excited about that because it was a reversal back to the Latin Mass, or to the Latin Rite in some way. And that's just one of the things. But the other thing that strikes me is when we go back and we think of I think of my parents, who would have been, they would know all the stuff with Latin Mass, and so they're now in their 80s, that it was an amazing kind of, they were packing the churches when the Mass was in Latin, and then there was obviously some growth in the church that said we must have it in the vernacular. Somewhere along the line there was a greater need to have it in the vernacular than in the Latin, and we've had the vernacular now. Now it's grand, I mean, when you're in an English-speaking country, no, you can follow it if you're in a different language country, but I mean, it's the same thing, you have an idea of what they're saying. But, so I'm not sure, I mean, I am quite happy with the vernacular that we have. I think, in a way, that's mass for me. And I remember that change in the 70s when suddenly the music changed. We had folk masses. We were able to express ourselves in a far more personal way because we were now praying and saying our own prayers, and we were being heard to the congregation. There was lots of pluses as far as I'm concerned. But you know, these are the kind of things that you know. No, we're in a funny old place with the church at the minute because COVID has stopped everything, and we're all trying to get up the machinery. Next thing we have to stop again. So
yes, it's pretty frustrating. All right.
That will bring its own pluses in the end. But as I was just delighted with the information I got tonight. That I
well, thank you. Yeah, I suppose the two things there. So the first bit, the example you gave of consubstantial. So I suppose there's various ways of telling that history too, and the full story would take a heck of a long time. But obviously, the production of the Missal of 1970 was one thing. The turning it into the various languages of the world was another thing. And over time, it came to be argued that that first translation was not what it might be. There was sort of, again, there were sort of ideological things there about whether the translation should be literal word for word, whether it should be you translate sort of the sense of a sentence or the sense of a clause, and you have things called dynamic equivalence versus literal equivalent. There's a whole language around translation. The group that oversees the translating into English on behalf of all the English-speaking countries in the world, they actually produced a new translation that Rome eventually rejected. I think that was a bad decision. I think that the rejection was, a lot of it was on ideological grounds and opposition and fear in certain quarters in Rome to things like the use of inclusive language and more and very basic inclusive language, like not turning God into an it, but just not calling the lady beside you your brother seems like a fairly small. There's no theological ground lost by saying brothers and sisters to refer to the people around you. There's absolutely no theological ground lost there. So that was rejected. And they were sent back to do it all again. And that ended up with what we have now as the Missal. Consubstantial with the Father is one of the things that's, I suppose we've got used to it over the years. We've now been using it for 10 full years. It was the start of Advent 2011. So it'll be 10 years this weekend. So lots of things that didn't trip off the tongue so easily at the start in the actual responses probably don't feel as weird now as they did at the start. But there are parts of that Missal, particularly the bits that change from day to day, like the prayers for different Sundays and so on. And some of them you really would need to sit down beforehand, sometimes with a ruler, to know which verb governs which noun and so on. Some of it is not English. It may be very accurate translation of the Latin, but if anything that you translate word for word, you're going to end up the wrong order in. Or you end up talking like Yoda. Very good it is. So that has not been. There's actually very few people now, including bishops, who would say that translation is wonderful. Obviously, you can't just decide after The problem is it's done now, and you can't just dump it immediately and do something else. Apart from the fact that an awful lot of churches have spent a fortune getting books, and the whole it's practical. You can't just, and it takes a while, several years for it to get bedded in and become natural. So it would be unfair to sort of throw it out, even though it's not great. But one of the reasons that it ended up the way it was is that a number of instructions came from Rome. I referred to Rome has often issued instructions about the proper interpretation of the liturgy and reform of the liturgy. And some of them, particularly those around translation, were not good. But one thing that Pope Francis has done in the last couple of years, I forget the name of the document, another Latin name document, he has, a bit like your friend Bishop Lucy, has given the competence to approve liturgical translations to the local bishops, not individual bishops, but to bishops' conferences, as opposed to Rome. This makes a lot of sense. There are times where there are people in Rome, in offices, approving or not approving translations into African and Asian languages when there's nobody in the office who can actually speak the language. Now that's an extreme example. There clearly are people in the offices who speak English, for instance, and we still ended up with what we ended up with. But he has transferred the competency to the Bishops' Conference. Now, Ireland isn't going to do it alone. Like the way they do is that this group of English-speaking conferences, when they next have to do anything, they're always working on some book or other. It might be the rite of confirmation or the rite of exorcism or something. When they're working on those, they work on them on using an international commission of all the English conferences. But when it comes to when that's produced, it will be approved by those countries. Rome will recognise that there's all sorts of technical language about recognition and approval, and I forget which is which. But Rome won't interfere and say you've got to change that word. Because the last time it went through all the years of revision, it was discussed very carefully in all the different countries by all the bishops' conferences and all their experts and advisors, and approved. And then what came back from Rome, there was hundreds, if not thousands, of changes had been made in it without any reference to anybody. That isn't going to happen again. But when we'll actually end up with a new version of a new translation of the Order of Mass, I don't know, because it wouldn't be wise to change it again anytime soon, even though you might not particularly like what's there now, because, as I say, you kind of get used to it after a while, and it will be very disruptive.
May I
Please?
insert a footnote? I just feel when a beautiful revised translation was made, finalised in 1996, approved by all the English-speaking Episcopal conferences, and then in 1998 rejected by a newly appointed cardinal in Rome who couldn't speak English.
But he had the power.
But the footnote, I suspect there was ideology at stake. The canon law is that every translation must be made from the Latin typical edition. But if you're translating for a tribal area in Papua New Guinea, there will be nobody who knows that language and knows Latin. So Rome knew that what was happening was that for those countries, they were using the English.
They were translating the English into their language rather than translating the Latin.
Their own language. So what Rome then wanted was to have that the English would be word for word corresponding with the Latin. Now that mightn't have been irresponsible to do that and to say, if you're going to translate into the language of Papua New Guinea and you can only work from the English, this is the English text you must use. That might not be irresponsible, but what was irresponsible was to impose that kind of an English version on English speakers. But they would never admit that translations were not being made from Latin. I mean, that's the politics of it.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
I think that's absolutely true, and I know for a fact, because in fact I remember talking to a Holy Ghost father who was working in Rome at one point, and he was involved in producing a translation for a region, I think in Sierra Leone. Now French might be the common language, but this was for for a region. It was English. So this was a local language, and likewise the amount of people who were native speakers of that language who were sufficiently competent in Latin to make a translation was non-existent. So they had to use English or another kind of big language.
That can't be admitted.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then I suppose the second question you made over there was about those bad old days of the liturgy not being understood by anybody, but in fact the churches were full. And look at us now, we all understand everything, the churches are empty. I know that's not the way you put it, but that's it's a kind of a summary. I don't know quite how to interpret that, because it's obviously there's factual, there's a certain semblance of truth to that. I think because something is we have the liturgy in the vernacular and we have fewer people in church. It isn't necessarily the case that we have fewer people in church because we have the liturgy in the vernacular, I suppose, is the... now, some people say, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? And yes, I would. But a lot more has changed in the world than the language in which the church worships. Traditions that still... that have, like Protestant traditions that have been praying in the vernacular for centuries are also struggling. So I don't think that it's the vernacular or accessible, understandable liturgy.
The other thing is, how on earth did the church transmit its doctrines to generally the majority of people not really knowing Latin other than what they heard in Mass? How did they get the teachings of their church across to that's what are people who, if you look back 100 years ago, the amount of education that people had, it just baffles me. And yet, now I can appreciate, as you say, we have so many more distractions in our world nowadays. I mean, from what I can hear, is people went to confraternities on a Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday because there was nothing else on.
A bit of that.
So it was a great way to go in between 7:30 and 8:30, but it was a great social activity that came out. So there was a whole social gathering. It was the only show in town sometimes. So
yeah, there's certainly a truth in that.
That's why the churches were full to a degree. But it just we are certainly inundated with other distractions.
Yeah. But certainly, I suppose there was a lot of knowledge. How much understanding there was is another question. So there was obviously the catechism was taught well and thoroughly in primary schools, and that carried people. My impression is that a lot of preaching was probably a bit more didactic than it would be now. It was more of a sermon. It was because it didn't have to be related particularly to any reading because people hadn't heard the reading anyway. But how much actual understanding there was is another question, because it is a big. I think it has been a negative feature in Ireland, that unlike some other countries that have tended to have a fairly strong Catholic culture or tradition, we don't have until recently, no lay people were studying theology, for instance. When I say recently, I mean the last 40 years. There wasn't a tradition in Irish Catholicism of that more serious, advanced engagement with faith. So I think a lot of it was, I don't want to say shallow, but it was at a particular level. And I think that has also cost us. Sorry?
We weren't encouraged to read the Bible.
This too is true. And so there was a lot of knowledge of the catechism, but how much actual understanding. And again, I don't want to sound like dismissive, because there was also huge faith and devotion, and you can use all kinds of things to argue against it and say, yeah, sure, there's nothing else to do, or or yeah, they were afraid of their life, they had to go to church, or they were afraid of their life, they go to hell. And there's truth, there's elements of truth in all of that, but there genuinely was a lot of really true deep spirituality and connection with the Lord too. So, and I think it is undoubtedly true that some of what has happened, the liturgy since Vatican II, hasn't been particularly helpful. Because, yeah, a lot of things, there was a lot of experimentation, a lot of allowing for self-expression and so on, and a lot of embracing of cultures from all over the world, all of which can be good. But it has, these things often need to be balanced, and sometimes they go too far, and so I think there has been in a lot of contexts a loss of that kind of sense of the sacred, and that then can lead people then to think, well, the only way I'll get it sacred is if I go to the crowd who do the Old Mass in Latin. And so I think we always need to be rebalancing what we're doing and focusing on what exactly are we about. And sometimes the Mass has been forced to bear the entire enterprise of the Church. The only place a lot of people have, insofar as they have any engagement with the church teaching, with Scripture, with exposition of Scripture, is in Mass. And often for events and things, the only way we know how to mark things liturgically is with Mass. And so that can actually be an impoverishment too, because it kind of sometimes shoehorns the Mass into places and shapes that it doesn't necessarily actually naturally belong or want to be, and it can get distorted sometimes. And so it's clear, I think, from what I've been saying tonight, that I'm not a particular fan of a lot of the traditionalist movement. That said, a good number of its critiques of what has happened have merit and need to be taken seriously.
We have reached the advertised closing time. Is there any other intervention that somebody wishes? We have space for one voice, yes?
Thank you for your presentation this evening. It was very good. But do you think this is a movement within the Church that is aimed at sort of destabilising Pope Francis?
Well, yes and no. So the world of people who are attached to the older form of the Missal and so on predates Pope Francis's pontificate, and so and they are who they are, and they're attached to it with different kinds of stuff in their baggage that goes with it. Some, it's plain and simple, that's how they like to pray. Some have other agendas, like the sort of rejection of the council that I was talking about. Undoubtedly, and it isn't just among liturgical traditionalists, there are a lot of people in the Church who I think do reject and fear Pope Francis. And whether it's because of the online world and so on that we have now, but it seems to be more acceptable to be absolutely horrid and toxic about the Pope than it used to be. Like, lots of people struggled to identify with some of the positions that, for instance, the Pope John Paul II took on morality, on liberation theology, on various things. And he was around a long time, so those who didn't feel particularly at home at that time had a long time to feel not at home. But maybe I have a rosy view of history. Of course, I was a lot younger then, but I don't recall such actual vicious opposition. Those people who were complaining and writing articles and and getting involved in various kinds of ways, if they and indeed going back further to the rejection of Humanae Vitae and artificial contraception and stuff, but you didn't hear people being sort of obnoxious about the Pope himself or impugning his motives. Cardinal Ratzinger had a bad reputation when he was in charge of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, but actually when he was Pope, people didn't, much at least, I know there were some outrageous slurs against him by certain people, but there wasn't a sense that was sort of, that he was fair game for any kind of conspiracy theory and nasty attack going, whereas there are some who will quite happily call the current Pope a liar and all sorts of things. And it just seems more, maybe it's just because of the online world that it's more brazen, I don't know what it is, because I'm sure there have been people who have said horrible things about the others too, but it seems that the negative minority are a lot louder. That's not a very scientific answer, but it's my impression. And that's why I sort of like to push back against it sometimes, because if he butters his toast on the pale side some morning, it'll be considered that he has done it to upset Pope Benedict, and you think, get a grip.
I think
with that delightful example.
a humorous point and a humorous note is a good point to draw our conversations to a happy close. The revisions of the liturgy made after Vatican II depended a great deal on scholarship, on people who had studied liturgy before, as it was in the 300s, the 400s, the 800s. And most of that scholarship was done by Benedictines. So we have a great deal for which to be grateful to our brothers in the order of Saint Benedict for the liturgical richness which we are now experiencing. And I began by mentioning the friendship between the Irish province and Glenstal, and the most recent expression of that has been involved Martin and his confrere Luke, and the publication of the Glenstal Companion to the Easter Vigil, which I was very happy to publish in
and we were happier still.
And if I was crassly commercial-minded, there we would
have a line of them up behind me.
have had copies on sale. But I just mentioned that as just one further example of the friendship that is there, and leading into, again on your behalf, expressing our gratitude and our appreciation to Father Martin for so helpfully opening our minds.
Thank you very much. Thank you.